Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the first of three spring lectures of the 2025 Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter, St. Louis Public Library Steedman Architectural Library Lecture Series. On behalf of the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, we are pleased to continue our collaboration with the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter and host this lecture series. Before we begin, we ask that you all please mute your devices. Should you be joining us remotely and have any questions, please type them into the comment section. After our talk tonight, we will pose your questions and those from our audience to tonight's speaker, Joe Fuoss. And now I'd like to introduce John C. Gunther, FAIA Lead AP, an architect, who serves as president of the Society of Architectural Historians St. Louis Chapter. He'll introduce our speaker for this evening's talk. John.
Thank you, Trent, for your welcome and for hosting this talk. Please know how appreciative we are to the St. Louis Public Library, Steedman Architectural Library, for our continued collaboration for our Architecture Around the World lecture series. It is my privilege to introduce our friend and colleague and tonight's speaker. Joel Fuoss, AIA, IIDA, Lead AP, is a principal with TRIVERS. Joel believes that as members of our communities, we should give more than we take, a mindset that drives his approach to architectural design and his commitment to improving the built environment. As a principal at TRIVERS, Joel champions thoughtful, creative design solutions across all project typologies in both new construction and adaptive reuse. He has led some of the firm's most complex and high-profile projects, earning the firm nearly 20 local, regional, and national AIA Design Awards in the past decade. Recognized for his advocacy and expertise, Joel has been invited to speak at conferences and seminars, sharing insights on design and firm culture he and his partners have built to support TRIVERS' portfolio of impactful work. Tonight, Joel will talk about the reawakening of a giant, the Butler Brothers Building Reimagined, a century-old warehouse reborn as a vibrant residential community. The Butler Brothers Building, constructed in 1906, was once a state-of-the-art distribution hub. But after sitting vacant for nearly 3 decades, it faced an uncertain future. Located in St. Louis' downtown West neighborhood, its sheer scale, deep floor plates, and historic integrity presented both challenges and opportunities for revitalization. TRIVERS embraced the complexity of this adaptive reuse project, carefully balancing preservation with transformation. The result is the Victor, a dynamic residential community that breathes new life into the structure while celebrating its architectural legacy. And now, please welcome Joel Fuoss as he presents The Reawakening of a Giant, the Butler Brothers Building Reimagined. Joel?
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, all right. I want to thank the invitation to speak on this project tonight. It's been a project like any other, and it's wonderful to be able to share this experience with colleagues, friends, family that are here as well. So I want to thank everyone for being here. So, as John mentioned, this project has been, I'd like to say it's more of in hibernation versus vacant for over 3 decades. It had just enough life to keep the systems going, and although not to its full extent and its full potential. So, you know, really when we look at projects like this, you know, they're really so important to protect our legacy that we have here in St. Louis, our architectural history, and be able to build upon that and carry that story into the future. And really being a part of this project was really wonderful to be able to take such a massive square block of our city and be able to carry it forward into the future. We talk about this a lot at TRIVERS, that buildings really should make a meaningful difference in our communities, and we really believe that. It's a big mission of how we practice. And it really takes creative ideas and creative thought to really think about how these buildings can be reused. It's not an easy task, and it really takes some innovation and sometimes thinking outside the box to really make these things work. So we really invite people to think that way as we're going through these projects, and we really need clients to be able to think about it that way as well. Fortunately, we had both as we move through this. So I'm going to share a little bit of the story, and we'll get into it here. So this was the building, hopefully everybody knows, does it? Show of hands, does everyone know the building, or just curious? All right, most people do. This building is located at 18th and Olive. And this was the building condition that we got it in 2020. She's dirty, worn, scarred, decades of change that have happened over the course of its lifetime. And our clients bought the building for $6 million, so 750,000 square feet for $6 million bucks. Rough math is about $8 a square foot. Not bad. To put this a little bit into context, the building is here on, as I mentioned, on 18th and Olive. And it's critical in its placement for a couple reasons. Really, first and foremost is the location of Union Station, which is the large rectangle here. When it was built at the time, this was a very direct connection to Union Station, and goods were able to be brought up just 4 blocks into the warehouse, and goods could be shipped in and out very easily. It's also, as you can see, pretty far from the Mississippi River. As the density increased at the core, this building had to be built a little bit further out, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So, most of you that are history buffs here in St. Louis might recognize this map. For those that do not, this is the 1876 pictorial maps that were illustrated of St. Louis. Really a treasure, I think, that we have to be able to look back this far and see what our city looked like. So as you can see, 1717 Olive is our site, and just beyond that, things kind of fall off a little bit. So there's not a whole lot going on after 18th Street in St. Louis at this time. I also want to point out where we are tonight. The library site, which is where we are here, was undeveloped at this time in 1876 as well. The site was developed a little bit later, and for those of you who have any information on what had become Harmony Hall, which was built on this site after 1876 at 18th and Olive, I would love to hear about it. It was designed by Isaac Taylor. It was only stood for 20 years. But we have records that it was here where the red dot is, and it was a social club. And the reason that was important as we talk about our chess legacy here in St. Louis is this was the location on this site in 1886, where the first World Chess Championship was held here in St. Louis. And I think some of you saw the banner on the initial image, and we're always curious of what that was really about. So something to clear up, the World Chess Championship wasn't held in the Butler Brothers Building. It was actually held in Harmony Hall. That was on the site before it was torn down. Nevertheless, it's an important piece in world history that these two gentlemen, Steinitz was the winner. He's the gentleman on your right. They had matches in New York, and then they traveled to St. Louis, and then they went on to New Orleans. And Steinitz won all 3 of his matches here in St. Louis and had a draw, and then went on to New Orleans and won. And that was the first World Chess Championship in 1886, and obviously has been a big part of the World Chess Hall of Fame, anchored here in St. Louis. So around the same time, a little bit later, actually in 1877, Edward Butler started a 5 and dime store in Boston with his brothers, George and Charles. And they were doing pretty good, selling goods at that point, and it really started to grow beyond 1877. And they really started to boom more so in New York, and this was their first store off of Broadway in New York. And Butler Brothers would continue to expand and really be taking over a lot of what they would do in New York, and then even go into the Ben Franklin stores in 1926 as a retail outlet, and Ben Franklin was in business until 1996. So they really had a kind of a long run of it. Interestingly enough, if you want to keep pulling that DNA through, Sam Walton got his start by buying a Ben Franklin store and be able to go from there. So you could even make that connection all the way through. And really what we talk about, the Butler Brothers warehouse and sales, it was really the Costco, Amazon of the day, Walmart of the day. And by the time the 19th century concluded and the 20th century began, they were really kind of rolling with things. And Edward Butler was really the one that kind of took charge. He really moved his operations then to Chicago. He was a director as part of the Columbian Exposition in 1893. He was a big collector of art. So he really had this kind of higher level of thinking and kind of society in Chicago, and really brought that to other places. And so this is a couple excerpts from their catalogs. And really you could go in, you could buy just about anything you wanted to, just like you could online today at Amazon. And they really played up their buildings, that you really could get anything in their building and get it to a retail outlet or a Ben Franklin store later in just a matter of days. So really not a new concept that we're dealing with today. It was just repackaged a little bit differently back then. So at the time that this building, that St. Louis was going, they had moved into a new building in New York along Broadway, which is still there. The Chicago store, which was here in the middle along Adams Street, which is now lost. And interestingly enough, they had established in 1898 a location in St. Louis where the current Fashion Square building is on 13th and Washington. So they had a location before they built the massive store here in St. Louis. So as you guys remember on the first map of the images of where the building ended up being located, this is a big reason why. This is a shot of 1906, so a little bit later, but just the image of what Washington Avenue looked like at turn of the century. It was packed, crowded. I think we would love to have a downtown this active these days, but really no place to go, especially for a building that needed to be essentially a full city block. So all the land was really taken up at this point, and so they had to look elsewhere if they were going to expand their building. So they did. So what they were able to find was a block at 18th and Olive, and it had been speculated by the St. Louis Library Board. So the St. Louis Library Board had bought the parcel, they had sat on it, and sold it to the Butler Brothers for $600,000 in 1903. And so that really was kind of the start of them moving forward with this thing. So this was in the papers and publications that we were putting out there. And it was great to just see this kind of reminiscent of the boom days of when this was going on. So it was really a big deal at the time. It was highly touted, and this was going to be the largest mercantile structure occupied by a single tenant west of the Mississippi, and one of the largest in the world. A lot of clarifiers, but it still was something they were excited about. So the library now has $600,000 that they got from the Butler company, and they then had to figure out what they were going to do with it to go forward. And so they had turned their sites to Exposition Hall in 1892, which again, when you start doing some of this research and see what some of these structures were, really incredible. So this was an exposition hall that was in 1892. Library board bought this site, cleared it, and then turned it into where we are tonight. So I thought it was a pretty interesting thread as we look through this to understand that that acquisition actually led us to the building that we're in tonight. So they sold it they were able to acquire $600,000 from the sale, and this building cost $1 million. So pretty good return on figuring out as far as a capital campaign. So we'll turn our attention back to the Butler. So at the time, they needed to find their architect, and John Lawrence Moran of Moran, Russell, and Garden was, a preeminent architect of their day. So he was hired to take on this new commission for this new massive building. propaganda-esque in the way they were talking about it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Is that better? Okay. Great, thank you. So as they were looking at this construction type and methodology in contrast to steel at the time, which steel was preeminent in happening in designing the main structures of the Wainwright, Union Trust, and chemical buildings, which all preceded this structure. They talked about the Butler construction as being safer, that they would, there was 0 deaths and no serious injuries. I'm not sure what classifies as serious or not in the turn of the century, but that's what was stated. So they were really touting this as the way to really build structures, you know, at this time in contrast to steel. This was a fortunate piece of a periodical we were able to find in 1907, the St. Louis Republic, 1907. And there's, I think, rarity that we find these construction shots of when the building was actually being constructed. And, you know, the stories that came out of that and just this reflection of what people were able to report on and what was happening at the time, it's really quite remarkable. They talk about that when they built the building, it started construction in September of '06 and finished in November of '07. So that's a pretty quick turnaround to demolish an entire site, prep it for construction, and build an entire new building. And it's, when they were digging on the western part of the site, they actually came into a quarry. So they actually placed a giant steam shovel in the middle of downtown St. Louis and were extracting limestone out of the middle of the block. And they would use some of it for the building of the building, and then they shipped the rest of it out. They actually tied a train track into the streetcar lines to get all of the stone out of the building. It was, you know, pretty remarkable that they were even to be able to do that. So I think a part of that is the building's ability to weather the course of this lifetime. Obviously, knowing that's embedded in stone, it's made out of concrete, is a pretty good start for it to last so long. So what really ended up being, we talked about this interesting methodology in construction, and it's cut off here in the bottom, so I don't know if everybody can see it, but the job superintendent was R.W. Maxton, and he came up with this formwork system that in order to make all those concrete columns, he came up with a system that allowed it to fluctuate from 34 inches to 18 inches from the top to the from the bottom to the top. So they're able to reuse the formwork and go up the building. So this allowed the building to be constructed, each floor, 92,000 square feet, were able to be done in 11 days. So pretty remarkable that they were able to do that fast, and again, with no deaths. 250 columns per floor. As I mentioned, they go from 34 inches wide to 18 inches at the top. And one of the things to note in the record builder that they talked about was that the concrete mix was very tightly controlled. And they even said there's opportunities for corruption, that contractors can take advantage of it and mix in things that are subpar that would compromise the strength of the concrete. So they watched this very closely as they went through the construction cycle. So as I mentioned, it was completed in 1907 at 750,000 square feet, 80,000 barrels of cement and 2,000 tons of high carbon steel and 5,000 perches of stone. Anybody know what a perch is? I had to look that one up myself. So a perch of stone is about 25 cubic yards, and it's about 16 feet long, 18 inches tall, and 12 feet deep. So in that quarry, they were able to extract 5,000 of those pieces. 7 million bricks were made here in St. Louis and used on site, and 20 acres of maple flooring. for a construction total of $2.1 million, which did my inflation calculation from 1907. In today's dollars, that's about $75 million. So not a cheap endeavor. So one of the interesting things about this is you guys saw how much steel, concrete, material went into this. And one of the calculations we did as we went through this exercise was to understand how much embodied carbon was in this existing structure. So this is to scale. So one Butler Brothers building, and that's Forest Park on the right. So it would take Forest Park 100 years to offset the amount of carbon that was put into the building under its construction. So that's the amount of material housed in this one piece that our entire city park would have to offset in a century. So when we talk about reusing these structures and then talk about the importance of this, it's not only preserving our architectural and our historical legacy, but it's also helping our environment and being sensible about what materials we're using. So a little bit on how this thing worked. So on the left is the first floor plan, and on the right is the second floor plan. And what'll come clear a little bit later is that 17th Street is a story taller than where 18th Street is. So Olive dives down as you go towards the west. So really the entire western section of the building over here was more, I would say, office space. There was a very limited amount of what we would think is office space that was really reserved for the structure. The rest of it was all open mercantile storage. And what we were able to really get into on the upper level side here is you can see all these arrows. So all those arrows are doors that brought in goods from the horses and carriages that were predominant in the day. The courtyard could hold up to 150 teams of horses as they were delivering goods. The other part of it, for a vertical structure, is the elevator transportation. So there's 13 different elevators that were servicing all of this. So these would come in from the courtyard on 17th Street and go up into the building and then be dispersed as you went through. This is the earliest photo of the completed building that we have current, what we could find. So we figured this is about a decade after the building opened. So we could maybe just tell by the cars there on the street. And then as Olive Street was having work done for the streetcar line. But, you know, it's always interesting to look back and see what was going on during the day when this thing was completed. Around the same time, Butler Brothers was also expanding their footprints in the other regions that they were located. You guys saw the Chicago building earlier, and they then built these two massive buildings in Chicago along the river, and these were strategically placed next to Union Station in Chicago, so it had both rail and river service. Expanded into New Jersey when they ran out of room in Manhattan, and then expanded up to Minneapolis in 1906, shortly after this building was built as well. There was also one built in Dallas, and this was done by Warren, Russell, and Garden, as same architects as here, and you can see a little bit of the similarities here. This corner stair, which was really done as an innovative fireproofing technique in the Butler Brothers building, was pulled into the Dallas store. You can see a little bit of it in the window fenestrations that had some similar, but you almost look up at the top here and they had some of the DNA pulled from the Minneapolis store. Unfortunately, in my mind, not everyone might agree, but in 1960, they thought they would do this a little bit differently and modernize the building and change it up quite a bit. And it even has stood the test of time from the 1960s conversion when in 2016, the Altera International Group, who's doing the Jefferson Arms project, took on and renovated the building and really restored the 1960s facade, and then renovated the building for residential. So fortunately, maybe ours wasn't taken down that path, and we had a little better starting point. I know this slide's a little blurry, a little tough to read. This was the only piece that we could find from of a floor plan that illustrated how they would display the merchandise. And this is from the Minneapolis store. But I think even from the pixelation of the photo, you can kind of see how dense it was in the store itself. They packed in things pretty tight. And so here's what it eventually looked like in St. Louis. So these are images actually from the St. Louis store. So you had women's apparel, men's apparel, housewares, toys, you name it. Again, it was just about anything you would want. Think about just scrolling through your Amazon wish list. Similar concept. What was also pretty striking on this, they didn't really spend much on decoration of anything else. The ceilings were left pretty raw, all concrete, exposed. Lighting was pretty minimal. You see some decor and some of the casework around some of the displays, but all in all, it feels more like a garage sale almost, or kind of a, yard sale. And not the most striking, so a little bit unexpected of what we would obviously expect to see today. I think this is probably the photo that the building has in its original grandeur. This was before, really, from what we can tell, any of the original fabric had changed on the building. The original cornice, windows, fenestration, all in place. This was sometime in the 50s. Fortunately, the Butler Brothers didn't last forever. As I mentioned, here in St. Louis, they established in 1898, and then by 1957, they announced the closing of the store. So they had about 275 people here that were working, and had to relocate them to Memphis and Kansas City. They were given the options to relocate. And by then, they had already scaled down pretty far. But what, if those of you know St. Louis history, in the 50s was the peak population of the city. So downtown was extremely crowded, congested. Obviously, you start to see the cars that we talked about earlier are now predominant modes of transportation, and the building became tough to get goods in and out of. And it was too far from the railway station, Union Station, to really make that feasible. They were really looking for other options to have direct loading from rail and or truck traffic. And the way the building was designed, it was very difficult to get trucks in and out of that courtyard. So the building was then announced to be closed. So why the St. Louis store and not the others? So they had established a 300-mile radius. So if Chicago, as I mentioned, they built it next to the rail station in Chicago. So that became obviously a very major hub for them. And because they could reach Chicago to St. Louis easily with rail, St. Louis became sacrificial, so they moved everything out away from St. Louis to hit Kansas City, to go west, and Memphis, and they could still cover St. Louis, and so they built a new distribution centers at Memphis and Kansas City, and left St. Louis. They weren't the only ones in the building there at the time. Is anybody familiar with Miss Elaine? Okay. So Selmore Garments were in the building that owned the Miss Elaine brand. Miss Elaine is still going today in St. Louis. This was some photos taken by Sean Dotson in our office, who found these stacked away, and really was kind of a part of the fashion goods that were still there, and a lot of unused boxes. I think there's still one maybe back at the office. Sean's shaking his head yes. So as the building, aged through, obviously a lot of you know that in mid-20th century, a lot of the buildings started losing their cornices. Butler, fortunately, lost only half. The cornice on the south and on the east was removed in 1964. So this image was post-1964. And really, there wasn't a whole lot going on with the building even up and through the 80s. And the National Registry for Historic Places for the Washington Avenue Historic District was formed in July of 1986. So the Butler Brothers Building, this was the condition in 1986. As you can see, all the windows were boarded up on the ground level, looked more like a fortress than a welcoming store at this point. But it was pulled into the historic district. As you can see, it's obviously a much bigger footprint than everything else in the district. There were 63 buildings in all that were nominated, and really it was intentional to come down and grab the Butler Brothers Building and the buildings across the street that helped support it. And so really that was probably one of its saving graces in it for it to hang on and to be redeveloped. So, why this building and why now? So as I mentioned, the historic nomination really allowed the building to be seen in a different light, to be preserved. And in 2007, there was a Part 2 that was approved for the historic tax credit, to take advantage of the state historic tax credits. For those of you who may not be familiar with that program, it essentially is saying what you're going to do to the building that's in accordance to the National Park Service standards for rehabilitation and renovation. And this is essentially a roadmap to say, all right, if you do this, you're going to be able to get your historic tax credits. And there was an approval in 2007 that stayed on the books and carried through. And for those who've been following the historic tax credits over the years and knowing that it had been tightened up through the Missouri legislature, and having this prior Part 2 approval was critical because it was uncapped. And what happened later on, as you guys know, the state capped the historic tax credits, and a building this size wouldn't have been viable to be reused without as many credits available as possible. So that was one key component. The MLS stadium was critical as well. And on top of that, the emerging NGA facility. So it really came down to finances, investment in the neighborhood, and jobs. So those were the keys and why this building was seen as a viable building to be redeveloped from our client. So this is an image as we got it in 2020, I guess. Again, varied fenestration on the ground level. All the original windows had been pulled out at that point. Again, the cornice had been removed. Again, dirty, kind of rough shape. So a nice surprise that we found in our research was the original drawings that we had by Moore and Russell and Garden. And you don't get this all the time. It was about, I don't know, about 30 drawings or so that we were able to find and go through and sift through and find clues and notes and anything that we could find to help us restore the building to its original grandeur was important in this. One of the things that I was personally struck by when we went through this is going up on the roof. And these are two of the structures that are up there. There's a series of 5 different structures that are on the roof. And these are all the overruns for those 13 elevators that were part of the distribution, plus water towers, plus the sprinkler system. And it almost felt like a little city up there. And rarely are you on a full city block that you feel that you're kind of in almost a little town on top of the city. And I think all of us that went up there were really struck by the kind of the nuance of that you really don't get from other buildings. The other key part was this entry from 17th into the courtyard, and this is where those teams of horses would come in. They would come in on the outside and leave in the middle, and it was this whole underbelly of the building that was so striking as you would come from really the street into the courtyard and to the interior of the building. Going into the building, you got a sense, I mentioned earlier, 250 columns per floor, so this is just a little slice of it. And as I mentioned earlier, the concrete structure is one of the things that made this thing stand the test of time. It really hadn't moved an inch, and it really was a part of it. Unfortunately, wood doesn't weather as well as concrete does. And, you know, we went into it wanting to preserve the wood and reuse the wood and try to save it, but most of it looked like this. It almost looked like a sand dune or a snowdrift or something like that. So those ended up not staying till the end. But as we went through, and again, I have to thank my colleagues here for taking some of these photos. I was sharing with John before, this pre-development state of these buildings, it's this like almost the darkest before the dawn. And you know, be able to capture their essence before we come in and do something new. And don't get me wrong, these buildings need something new. They need to be revitalized. They need to have a different future. But as we practice and we develop through this, we understand, and I think we really take seriously the history that was there. And we're very sensitive to the fact that that history is important, no matter if it was 1906 or 1956 or 2006. That we need to think about how we go through that. And so it really is important to capture that as you go and just almost see the degradation over time and what that does to the building, and just experience that before the building is turned over. This is one of those penthouses up on the roof, and this is the elevator equipment that again had been removed, and again it's a little bittersweet to take it out, even though we needed to, but knowing that it was there. One thing that we did do was keep these archtop windows. So those archtops that you guys see on the east side of the building are the original windows that we did leave in place. Another big aspect was all these fire doors. So as the building was being designed, it was this fireproof fortress, and it was critical that it was, you couldn't burn this thing down. And as we went through the National Park Service approval, it was really important for us to maintain as many of these fire doors as possible. And I think a lot of you have probably seen these, but how they worked is actually they were held in place over here on the left, and the upper rod was angled down, and so there was a fusible link. So there was a link that would, when it got hot, it would burst and then let the door just slide shut. So it used gravity just to close the door. And obviously very critical in the makeup of the building and what the building was about. So we really focused on trying to maintain as many of these as possible. Again, as I mentioned, we had the gift of having the original drawings, and one of the things we were really struck by was the original clamshell doors. These were the loading dock doors, so all those arrows that were shown on the floor plan to get the building populated with goods, these were the doors that opened into the courtyard. And so we were really conscientious about how we were going to preserve as many of these as possible. And fortunately, we had the original drawings to complement the locations where we needed to replace windows. There are original gates that were in place on 17th Street to close off the courtyard. Those were still in place, although a little beat up. And it had its corresponding original drawings there as well. And fortunately, we were able to hang on to those and fix those in place ultimately. As I mentioned earlier on, there was not a lot of built-out space for offices. Most of it was dedicated towards mercantile storage and sales. The one built-out space that really remained was the vestibule along 18th Street. And this had sections of marble, granite, and wood. And one of the things that happened as we were going through the renovation process, somebody called and said, hey, by the way, I've got the original doors to the Butler vestibule if you guys want them. And so our contractor bought them. I don't know if we know how much they bought them for, but they got them back. So that was a nice little turn of events that we were able to restore the doors to their original locations. So I mentioned the fashion and garment history that this building is a part of. And so when we're going through and trying to really understand what concepts we want to hang on to for a building and how we want to really think about the structure going forward, we really look into that history. And fortunately, this building has a lot to draw from. So we pull together these boards and to really think about how that is going to play into the design going forward. Also, a part of that was the chess history. As I mentioned, the site and the Chess Hall of Fame obviously made a big deal out of it. So we wanted to carry that forward as well, and that's you know, kind of a secondary piece that we wove into our concepts as we were going forward. So as you kind of pull all this together, you've got a little bit of this legacy of the building, you've got the story, you've got the fashion, you've got the architectural elements, and you start to kind of give yourself your parameters that you start to work with. And so this became a little bit of the color palette and the color blocking that we would start to outline how the building would work from an interior design standpoint. As we conceptualized how this was going to rework into an adaptive reuse for residential, I started going through the drawings and was really struck by this building section that was part of the original document set. We talk a lot about it in the office, and those that are here from TRIVERS might smirk at this a little bit. I always talk about designing in section, and I love section drawings and section axons especially. But this was so telling when we started looking through these drawings and saw this connection here. And going from the 17th Street connection on this side down to 18th Street, this became a linchpin in our design going forward. Originally, this is just a loading dock, and there was a boiler room, and there was an original flue that went up through here. So there was no really direct connection other than some internal stairs through that, but there was no visual connection through that. But that was something that we really were struck by as an opportunity going forward. We then digitally scanned the entire building. So this is an excerpt from our point cloud scan, which is a 3D image that we took of the entire building. So if anybody's curious of what the building looked like before we renovated it, we can put you anywhere in the structure and show you what a certain spot looked like. So it's a fantastic record of the project that we have. Sorry, Joe. And so this was a great starting point for us to be able to look at where we could go with it. So from that, we were able to make our 3D model, and this is what we were able to make from that. And so what started to come to fruition here was this, where am I? All right, maybe that's not working now. Is in the courtyard, that visual connection that we were looking at in that section started to take place here on the western side of the courtyard. We also needed to expand the courtyard further to the east. So half the courtyard, or a portion of the courtyard you can see is in white versus gray. And this was a part of the courtyard we had to remove and push towards the east to make the units on the east side of the building more viable as a residential use. Everything on the west we pretty much kept intact. and then really filled a lot of the building with parking that would surround a lot of these other areas as well. So again, a little bit on how this works. So the diagram for the new, the conversion of the building really didn't differ too much from the original diagram, at least on the first floor. So the western side of the building on areas 3, 2, and 3 were really just left for office space in the original historic lobby, while the rest of it, while it was warehouse, was now just warehousing cars. On level 2, we then conceptualized having the central court be still the main focus and ring it all with the amenities for the adaptive reuse of the building. We were really drawn to the activity that this building had, unloading and loading goods and bringing this life into the building. We really wanted that to be the focus of the kind of the heart of the building, and is why we put all the amenities for the building around that. We also then brought the courtyard, instead of it coming all the way into the courtyard from 17th Street, it is now the access to the second level ring of parking that rings that space around the perimeter. On the upper levels of the building, there are 384 apartments. So each of those, each floor plate rings from floors 3 through 8, ring the courtyard and the outside perimeter with residential units. And then on the roof, we added a pool there as item 13, outdoor decks, and other spaces, courtyard gathering spaces, and then, also a pickleball court, which was a high priority of our client at the time. So as I mentioned, the original Part 2 that was approved, and when we got our hands on the building, we started looking at what the Part 2 had, and our client was like, let's just do that, we'll go forward. And then we started looking at it a little more closely, and we determined that we didn't need to do what they were suggesting. It was much more detrimental to the original fabric of the building. It really removed, we can see here, all the hatched area was area to be removed from the original fabric. So they had planned to remove all of that central courtyard, the elevator banks and then the stairs, and then the other stairs there in the corner. So a massive change to the feel and the history of the building that was quite surprisingly approved in 2007. So this was our change to that. So we kept 3 out of the 4 walls of the courtyard and really only removed the eastern section of the courtyard, 2 bays deep and 3 bays across. And then we kept every other stair, original stair and elevator core. So this equated to about 13,500 square feet of material that we saved per floor. And for the totals of floors 3 through 8, this is about 81,000 square feet of original material that was saved. So going up to the roof, you guys remember I was talking about how struck I was on the rooftop, and they had proposed a 2-story penthouse, new build, on top of this. And so we really didn't need any extra square footage when we had 735,000 square feet to work with. So we decided that we weren't going to do that, and we were going to keep these structures and really weave these into the overall design of the building. And so this was a massive undertaking to, what they were planning to do. They were removing all the rooftop monitors, all these penthouses, all the overruns, and really changed that overall feel of that rooftop. So this is what we ended up doing, just the section there on the right. So what we were able to save was about 106,000 square feet of material. And for those of you who know, our the Steel Coat Lofts building down by the Target, the new Target there, that building, the amount of material that we saved by changing our approach on this is 2 of those buildings. So that's how massive one this building is, and how much material they saved just by changing our approach on what we were doing. So it finally came the day for us to get to work. So the first thing the building got was a bath. It had, from what I know, never been cleaned. And for those of you who've seen images of St. Louis in the 1920s, where it was just dark from coal, soot, and burning, all of the building had all of that and then some. So that was the first step in the process, and it needed it. Shortly thereafter, certainly going through the courtyard and removing those eastern sections, and really working with the National Park Service and coming back and reskinning the new area. It had to be very different than the original white glazed brick that we had on the original corridor, or on the original courtyard. Again, we kept the lid, as I mentioned earlier, how striking that whole lid was as we went through that space. This was a view looking down onto the courtyard, really after everything was removed. We left the third floor deck, as I mentioned. This is actually repairing some of the deck on the courtyard itself, where it had just taken on enough water and really rusted through. And then the section where we have the new stair going in hadn't been demolished yet there on the right side. You know, these buildings are always full of surprises, some weird things in there. This is one of the original package chutes that we found when we were pulling out the area for the stair. And, you know, again, fortunately, we matched that up to some drawings that they had done for these little moments as well. This is the area where the stair had been removed, so you already can kind of see, looking through the space and getting daylight there to the east as a lot of that material is cleared out. The few pieces of historic fabric that were left in the remaining parts of the building had moments like this. This was just a little partition in the receiving dock area. You know, as many notes as you put on a drawing and tell people, don't demolish something, keep it, somebody does it, mistakes happen. This unfortunately was demolished, but was replicated piece for piece and was rebuilt later on. So there are 814 windows on this project, and 2 that stayed in place. But being a massive building that it is, it has a lot of windows. And to get that right, obviously it's a big part of the character of the building that needs to be considered. So, is Frank? Frank's not here tonight, so I don't know if he knew he was gonna make it on here. But it really takes meticulously going through, measuring the drawings, measuring the infield conditions, and looking at each type and matching it to it. This is critical in the National Park Service criteria and how they understand, you know, what buildings are following the standards and how those are, you know, really keeping the historic integrity of the structure. So, it took us 20 months in construction, so longer than it actually took to build the building, to renovate it. And we ended up with 735,000 square feet because we subtracted about 15,000 out of it, 384 units. It cost about $98 million to renovate, which, if you remember, it cost about $75 million to build it. Now that's a lot of units and living spaces that are much more intensive than open space, so keep that in mind. For those that follow the state historic and federal tax credits, it was allocated $31 million in state credits and $25 million in federal credits. And those were sold to U.S. Bank and Bank of America, respectively. So huge investments and huge buyers of that are obviously on the national scale. So now for my probably favorite part here. So as I mentioned, this is the before before we started cleaning the structure. Again, as you can see, There's pink granite here at the base, there's orange brick and purple frieze in the terracotta, and just really just years of soot and dirt. So when we're able to clean it up a little bit, it was amazing when we went out there and saw the vibrant oranges, and I mean, just the purple in the terracotta was so striking. The pink granite, which obviously soaks up a lot of that soot, just, cleaned off immaculately. So this is a view into the lobby. So as I mentioned, the historic vestibule was really the only thing that remained of much consequence inside from a finish standpoint. So you can see the marble stairs. They had blocked in the wall there with a little metal door and really covered up all the woodwork. And so this was really that historic entry as we got it in 2020. And here's what we were able to do with it after that. So again, original doors put back in place, the wood restored, and then we like to talk a lot about addition by subtraction as well. We wanted to keep the original floors in this. We really tried hard to keep the original floors in this section. It just wasn't in the cards, and we did have to replace this floor with a new floor as well. Again, you can see some of the black and white, if you guys remember some of those earlier, the color blocking. You can see some of that in here, that chess motif. You see some of the fabrics in the chairs, again, picking up on that fashion connection. This is a little hard to place yourself where you are, but this is essentially at the lobby's right behind you. And so there's a hallway that connected Locust and Olive Streets. And this was a little cafeteria. So they had, you kind of went in here and got some food, and wasn't all that inviting. But this was the location for the new monumental stair. So that little mouse hole was right here where the steps are. And then, as you can see, you now can see up into the courtyard. And so it was really important for us as a locator for you to be able to be in the building and understand where you are in this 735,000 behemoth, and understand that, there's a courtyard beyond, there's something else there, there's light coming in, and then you had, your entry and your light behind you. And it really makes this, vertical connection that was really important to create, connections of people and wellness, and be able to have this interaction of people using that versus, getting in your elevator to go up to the second floor. This is the connection here towards Olive Street. Again, if those of you remember on the Olive elevation, there was an old mid-century stone portal that was added, and this was the entry off of Olive, really not very ceremonious. There was an original terrazzo floor here that we did keep, we did maintain, but we, again, addition by subtraction, we blew all that out and smoothed out the steps and made it a ramp and exited towards Olive Street, and then really recreated an entry point off of the elevators to the connection to the mailboxes, and really tying in the motif of the terrazzo that was original just outside of this decorated space on the floor, and really create a welcome zone for new residents. If you remember, this was our unfortunate partition that was lost during construction, but this is the location here after we renovated it for the new lounge space. If you can see in the top right-hand corner, those are the clamshell doors that we had kept in place, and so each one of those spaces have the original clamshell doors pulled up and really held up. And I think a lot of people that walk into these spaces kind of reach up and touch and ask about what these things are, which was the whole point of us doing it. We wanted to tell the story of the building and have that be a part of its narrative. Again, seeing some of the motifs Some of the patterning in the back, again, tying it to that fashion connection, and some of the coloration that we had talked about as well to really tie back to that early fashion industry. On the second floor here, this was a main corridor going north and south, and again, we were able to change this up and add this to be a lounge. We call this more of a passive lounge for people to hang out and, not as active as the other one that I showed previously, but allowed people to, hang out here a little bit more in peace and quiet. So the courtyard then here originally found on the left, again, removing those two bays, pushing it to the east, and really making it, again, distinctive from the white glazed brick on the rest of the facade, and creating a new terrace up on the third floor. And even though we brought up the level of the floor so you could circulate around the entire courtyard, you can still see through out towards 17th Street. So that was critical for us to be able to keep that visual connection, but be able to really make it also practical that people can circle around the entire court without going outside. So again, once this courtyard was full of life and teeming, we wanted to circle it with life, but then have the inside be a little bit more passive, bring in some vegetation and some green in an area that really hadn't had it for quite some time. This is looking back, so this is the area that was removed for the inclusion of the new monumental stair. And so this is, as you're coming from 17th Street into the courtyard, this is what you'd be arriving into. And this is what we were able to do. So all of that came out. A new glass curtain wall was put up, and we raised that up a little bit. We did add some skylights in there, and that's where the new monumental stair is. So again, a place you can occupy. We left the concrete unpainted. We really wanted to be sure that we had that rawness that was still evident in the building. And it's actually one of my favorite places to be, to sit out there and just kind of be covered, but also be connected to the outdoors. On the upper floors, when you're doing a new building, you've got to squeeze every square inch. Every square foot you build costs a lot of money. And again, as I mentioned in this thing, we weren't too worried about having square footage. So we have these opportunities where we can create these zones here a little bit more for breakout spaces. You don't see this too much in residential buildings. It's an opportunity for us to have a little bit of relief as you come off the elevators and be able to have something there that's not always evident in new builds. This is a typical floor, and this is just an idea of the way the units lay out. We really turn them perpendicular to be able to bring that light as far into the space as possible, and really be able to get that deep into the space. One of the things that we did is we had to custom make the LVT. Again, we couldn't salvage all that wood, so we had to put a new topping slab. And we did have an approval for an LVT, although it had to be custom sized, dimensioned, and colored to match as close to the original maple as we could. So there's about 500,000 square feet of LVT in this building. That's historically accurate LVT. Again, the roof, you get the semblance of some of these structures that were up there. And then what we're able to do with it. Again, those of you who've been up there, or those that, it's a wonderful place to be at night. You've got a great view of the city skyline to the east. You've got a great view of the city stadium, city SC Stadium to the west, and just a wonderful vision of this city itself. Short little anecdote here, and as we're going through this process, our client reached out to us and asked us what we were doing about our own office space, and at the time we had just said, we're not doing anything, we're just going to stay pat for a while. And they came and said, look, like, why don't you come in the Butler Brothers? And I was like, well, I don't know if it's going to make sense. So we started talking about it. And this space that we had designed programmatically for the building was part of the original office space that was going to be set aside for a work, kind of a work zone for residents in the building, but got cut from a budget standpoint. And, you know, we were able to work out a deal, and we moved into our space at the ground floor of this in May of last year. So we were able to really be a part of, you know, something that we put a lot of our own heart into, and, you know, make it our new home. So, you know, this was important for us as we talk about the future of downtown St. Louis and what's been happening here. We do a lot of our work here. We do a lot of our work as adaptive reuse historic work. And it's important for us to make a statement that we do believe in urbanism, we do believe in the city, we do believe in reusing these structures. We were on the 18th floor, we're now on the ground floor, so people can see people, we can see other people, the lights are on. So it was a really important statement for us to come here and say this is something that we're a part of and that we believe in. And you know, it's a little bit more of our DNA, and seeing the history of this building and melding it with modern vision and I don't know, modern design, and that's really a big part of what our firm is about. I wanted to kind of leave on this piece of a quote, actually from the 1906 St. Louis Globe Democrat. Extensive improvements will result from the establishment of others which always follow a pioneer firm into a new section. So in 1906, this building was seen as a pioneer into a new section that was designed to attract others. And you know, as this building was renovated over 100 years later, it's still seen as that now too. So, you know, I think everybody wants this thing to be, you know, a new anchor in downtown West, and you know, we're anxious to drive what other additional investment around it to continue the momentum in downtown West. And that's it. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Or any questions from anybody? Yes, sir.
Excellent presentation, and I hope you get a full.
Thank you.
Throughout the renovations, you would say we. So I'm curious, what was the head count for we, and what kinds of disciplines were brought together as you were making these decisions?
Great question. There was a lot of we's. Within our TRIVERS team, I think we probably had upwards of maybe 8 to 10 people in the office working on it at one time. A lot of different people touched it at different stages. You know, we had engineers, structural engineers, MEP engineers, a historic consultant that had worked on it for the part 2. We had to file a whole amendment that was amending the original part 2 and said, never mind, we're not going to do all this, we're going to do this, you should like it better, and fortunately they did. Our client was only a team of 3, and they were obviously pivotal in this. Contractor was selected early on, Perrick, and they were instrumental in the entire process as we went through. You know, this was done, as I mentioned, we first went through it in November of 20. If you guys remember, a lot of 2021, a lot of price increases, supply chain conversations that were happening, especially in the construction world. We really had to chase our tail a few times. So those would probably be the main players, but there's a lot of other folks that made this happen. Many of them are in the room tonight too, so I thank them. Yes, sir. Yes, it was requested a couple times from folks. We did have it priced. It was about $1 million to to do to restore the cornice, you know, along what, 300 feet-ish total. So, I mean, it was a lot. So we did ask the questions, we did look at it. It was probably a card we could have played if we were maybe in a bind, if something wasn't gonna happen, but it's tough. It's a tough sell on that one. Our owner, they would have liked to have done it if it worked. Yeah, we would have too. It would have been great to see it put back. Yeah, it just feels a lot different with it on there. Anybody else? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Is the diner still there?
The diner is still there. I was going to mention that. If you want to swing by and see the building and grab a burger, the diner is still there. Although I will say, it's a misnomer that I thought it was kind of fast, kind of a quick service. You kind of have to give yourself some time. It takes a little while. I'm not sure why, but yeah, it takes a little while. All right. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. Just wanted everyone to know about we're having another Steedman Talk next month. Let's see, what day is it? I think it is March 25th. It will be Noah Morris. He's a graduate student at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at WashU. He'll be giving a talk entitled Codifying Domesticity, the story of the recommended minimum requirements for small dwelling construction of 1923, the housing policy of the Hoover Secretariat, and the impact on American residential architecture. So that's, again, March 25th, 6:30. So thanks all for coming tonight. Drive safely and have a good evening.